$590 billion, 183,000 workers, 3,400 tons of gold, and yet not a single sound on the construction site. 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem, a building was erected that dwarfs any modern megaproject in cost. Dubai's Burj Khalifa, the Large Hadron Collider, NASA's space program, none of them even come close to the amount invested in the 7-year construction of a single temple in the Judean hills. But that isn't the main paradox. The main one is this: the building was constructed in complete silence. And the reason for this silence will change everything you thought you knew about this place. You probably imagined Solomon's temple as a beautiful religious structure, something like a large church with columns, a place for prayer, a place for ceremonies, solemn but understandable. That image is wrong, completely. The real Temple of Solomon was so different that modern descriptions of its size, materials, and purpose sound almost like science fiction. But this is not fiction. It is a reconstruction based on a text that has survived for 3,000 years. But first, we need to understand where this idea came from in the first place, and why its originator never lived to see it realized. David knew he would be refused. He was a great king, a unifier, a man who forged scattered tribes into a nation with an army, a treasury, and a capital. Jerusalem became his city. He personally brought the Ark of the Covenant, the nation's primary religious artifact, there to the sound of trumpets and dancing. He gave the Israelites everything, except for one thing. He wanted to build a permanent house for God, and for this very reason, he was denied. The reason sounds harsh. David had shed too much blood. His were the hands of a warrior, and a temple cannot be the work of a warrior. It is a place of peace, and a man of peace must build it. David accepted the verdict without argument, but he didn't stop. Instead of stepping back, he began to do the one thing he was permitted to do: prepare. And this is where a detail that is almost never mentioned comes to light. David didn't stockpile resources for the temple for a year or even 10. He gathered them his entire life. Every victorious war, every trade agreement, every tribute from conquered nations, all of it went into a special reserve, not into the state treasury, not for the army, specifically for the temple. By the end of his reign, the accumulated volume was so staggering that modern historians still debate whether it was even possible. 3,400 tons of gold. That is not a metaphor. It is a calculated figure based on biblical data. For comparison, the combined gold reserves of all the world's central banks today total around 3,000 tons. David had amassed more than all the nations of the world hold today, and he passed it all to one person: his son. Solomon inherited the throne and the fortune on the same day. He was about 20 years old. Before him lay a nation, vast reserves of materials, and his father's dream, which he had been unable to fulfill. But even that wasn't enough. Because it's one thing to have gold, it's another thing entirely to know what to do with it. Israel at that time lacked the building traditions of the Egyptians or Phoenicians. The nation was strong in warfare and agriculture, but not in architecture of this caliber. They didn't have the necessary craftsmen. They didn't have the right materials. They had no cedar, and cedar was a mandatory requirement. Its unique scent, density, and resistance to insects and rot made it the only possible material for the sacred space. and cedar did not grow in Israel. Solomon did what any smart ruler would do. He called his neighbor. Hiram, king of Tyre, was the man you could call with such a request. Tyre was located on the Mediterranean coast and controlled trade routes from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Phoenician craftsmen were masters of stone, metal, and wood, with skills that were unrivaled in the Middle East at the time. They knew how to saw cedar logs so the boards wouldn't warp. They knew how to cast bronze pillars several meters in diameter, and they were the ones Solomon hired. The deal was this: Tyre would supply lumber and craftsmen, and Israel would supply food. Annually, this amounted to 20,000 measures of wheat and 20,000 measures of olive oil. This was no symbolic payment. It was enough to sustain an entire city. Hiram fed his people with Israelite grain, while his craftsmen built a foreign temple. The alliance was pragmatic, cold, and ran like a machine. But this was just the beginning of the logistics. The real nightmare was just getting started. Imagine you need to transport thousands of massive cedar logs from Lebanon to Jerusalem. No trucks, no railways, no cranes. Only people, ropes, rafts, and mountain paths. The logs were first brought to the sea, tied into rafts, and floated down the coast to Jaffa, the nearest seaport to Jerusalem. This itself was a dangerous task. The Mediterranean does not forgive mistakes with unwieldy, multi-ton timber rafts. Then, the logs were unloaded and the ascent began. From Jaffa to Jerusalem is a 50-kilometer uphill journey, an elevation gain of nearly 800 meters. There were no modern roads, only rocky trails through gorges under the summer Judean sun, which can heat the stones to scorching temperatures. And that was just the wood. The stone was quarried elsewhere. Underneath Jerusalem were subterranean quarries. They still exist today. Tourists descend into them and see the tool marks on the walls, marks that are 3,000 years old. Workers went underground into the darkness, toiling by the light of oil lamps. Stone dust clogged their lungs. The smell of oil and dust lingered for hours after a shift. They extracted enormous limestone blocks and carved them into precise shapes, down there in the dark, in advance, without ever seeing the building or the spot where the block would be placed. And here we find the central mystery of the construction, the one detail that makes it all seem nearly impossible. When a block was finished, it had to fit perfectly, not almost perfectly, not with a little adjustment, perfectly. Because on the construction site, there was no finishing work, none at all. Not a single hammer strike, not a single scrape of a saw, not a sound of metal on stone. The site was silent. This is not a legend. It was a technological requirement stemming from a religious prohibition. Iron was considered the metal of war. Swords, spears, arrowheads, all were made of iron. And touching the sacred space with the tools of war was forbidden. Therefore, all stones were dressed in the quarries, completely, down to the last millimeter. And then they were delivered to the site, ready for installation. Try to imagine the engineering challenge of this decision. You have to cut a block in the darkness underground, giving it a precise shape based only on a blueprint, with no chance to test its fit on site, and then send it several kilometers away, hoping it will slot into its intended place. A single miscalculation, and the block wouldn't fit. And a block weighs several tons. It can't be reworked. It can't be lifted again. It's useless. And that means there would be a hole in the wall. They made no such mistakes. How do we know? Because the temple stood for 400 years and did not collapse on its own. It was destroyed from the outside. From within, it was perfect. But that wasn't even the harshest part of this project. 183,000 people. This number is officially recorded in the source text. 30,000 were Israelites working in shifts of 10,000 per month. They would go to Lebanon, work for a month, return home for 2 months, and then go back. 70,000 were carriers. They transported stones, logs, metal, everything the temple was built from. And 80,000 were stonecutters. They were the ones who went underground. But the Israelites worked in shifts and returned home. Those who carried and cut, the majority of them, did not. They were descendants of conquered peoples, conscripted for the construction. Not slaves in the modern sense, but not free laborers either. They were not paid. They were not asked. They built a structure meant to be a symbol of God under coercion, without choice, without their names recorded in the Chronicles. Not a single one of them was named. Not one. And this is not just a social detail. It is a hidden fault line beneath the foundation of this entire story. It was this fault line that would ultimately destroy not the temple itself, but the nation that built it. But that was still a long way off. First, the building itself. 7 years. That's how long the construction took. By the standards of the time, it was phenomenally fast for a project of this scale. The Egyptian pyramids took 20 years or more to build. Solomon's temple took 7. And this was despite its dimensions, which, though smaller than the pyramids, were comparable in the complexity of their finishing. Because the finishing, that's where the real expense lay. The outer walls were stone, but inside, everything was different. Every wall was paneled with cedar boards. Every board was covered with carvings of palm trees, cherubim, open flowers, and interwoven patterns. This wasn't just decoration. It was a theological message carved in wood. The space recreated the Garden of Eden. You walked inside and found yourself in a place meant to evoke the beginning of everything. What existed before the fall? A world without death. And on top of that, gold. Everything was covered in gold. Not thinly gilded. It was overlaid with plates of gold. The floor was gold. The walls were gold. The ceiling was gold. Even the nails used to fasten the gold plates were gold. 50 shekels per nail. We know the exact price of a nail. When the morning sun streamed through the open gates, it struck the gold and reflected back outside with such intensity that a person standing outside couldn't look directly at the building. This is not a metaphor. It's the physics of gold's reflection in direct sunlight. The temple was literally blinding. And that is why the high priest did not enter every day, only once a year, and only one person in the entire nation. And even then, not without reason. This is where the real fear begins. Inside the temple were 3 spaces. The first was the ulam, the entrance hall. The second was the hekal, the main hall, where 7 lamps burned, the altar of incense stood, and the table of showbread was placed. The third was the devir, the Holy of Holies, a 9-meter cube completely covered in gold, with no windows and no light sources. Absolute darkness. And it was into this space that the high priest entered once a year. He entered with the blood of a sacrificial animal and with burning incense. The smoke was a mandatory condition. If the high priest entered the Holy of Holies and saw what was inside without the protection of smoke, he would die. This was not a symbol. It was a literal command. The smoke had to create a veil between the man and the presence, which could not be approached without protection. And to ensure there was no doubt about the seriousness of this, a rope was tied to the high priest's leg before he entered, so that if he died inside, his body could be pulled out without anyone having to follow him in. Because to follow meant to die as well. Consider this detail: a rope on his leg, once a year, before entering a dark golden room. This wasn't a religious ritual in pastel tones. It was a life or death mission, performed by one man once a year, with the understanding that he might not come out alive. But this still doesn't explain what stood at the center of that darkness. In the Holy of Holies stood the Ark of the Covenant. It was 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. A wooden box overlaid with gold. Inside were 2 stone tablets with the 10 Commandments. On the outside was a golden lid, upon which stood 2 cherubim of solid gold with their wings spread. The ark was not merely a relic. It was a focal point. A point in space where, according to the text, the presence of God was not a metaphor, but a reality. The space between the wings of the cherubim was called the meeting place. It was there that conversations were had. It was there that answers were received. That is why it could not be touched. That is why the priests carried it on poles, not with their hands. Once a man touched the ark with his hand. He was trying to steady it as it was about to fall from a cart. He died instantly. He was not an enemy. He was a priest trying to help. And now this object stood in the center of a golden cube, in darkness, behind a veil of smoke, in a building that cost more than all of today's national gold reserves combined. And when everything was ready, something happened that no one could explain. The day of the temple's dedication. Solomon stands before a huge crowd. The Levites are singing. The trumpeters are sounding their horns. The noise hangs over Jerusalem. The ark is carried into the Holy of Holies. The priests exit the temple back into the open space. And at that moment, according to the description from a text that has come down to us unchanged for 3,000 years, the temple was filled with a cloud. Not fog, not smoke. A cloud, so dense that the priests could not go back inside. They could not continue the service. They stood outside and watched as their temple, which they had just spent 7 years building, disappeared into a white, impenetrable haze. Solomon stood before the crowd and said aloud what everyone was thinking. "The Lord has said that he would dwell in the thick darkness." This was not a poetic image. It was an attempt to explain the inexplicable at the very moment it happened. The presence had arrived, and it had come not as light, but as impenetrable gloom, as the very darkness that could not be witnessed without the veil of smoke. The most powerful place in the history of human architecture was inaugurated not in brilliance, but in shadow. And it was at that moment that the countdown began, because what was meant to be an eternal symbol of unity already carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The construction cost more than just money. It cost social peace. The forced labor of 80,000 stonecutters and 70,000 carriers created a tension within the nation that did not disappear when the building was finished. These men received nothing but the right to say they had worked on the temple. Their families lived without providers for 7 years. Their children grew up without fathers, and they remembered. Solomon, in turn, faced a financial problem that not even his father had foreseen. Maintaining the trade alliance with Tyre cost the country an astronomical sum each year. The debt to Hiram grew so large that Solomon was forced to give him 20 towns in the country's north. 20 towns for lumber and craftsmen. Hiram came, inspected them, and called them Kabul, which in Phoenician meant something like worthless. He was not pleased. The debt was never fully settled. Government spending required higher taxes. The taxes hit those who had already suffered from the forced labor. Discontent simmered. By the end of Solomon's reign, the nation was buzzing with a hidden tension that the temple's splendor did not conceal, but, strangely, amplified. Because the more majestic the building, the more obvious the price that ordinary people had paid for it. But this was not yet the catastrophe. The catastrophe came later. Solomon died. His son Rehoboam ascended to the throne. Representatives of the people immediately came to him with one question. "Your father put a heavy yoke on us. Will you lighten it?" Rehoboam took 3 days to consider. First, he asked the elders, those who remembered David's reign and understood how power and public trust worked. They said, "Be lenient, answer them gently, promise them relief, and the people will be yours forever." Rehoboam listened and did the exact opposite. He came on the 3rd day and said, "My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. My father laid a heavy yoke on you. I will make it heavier." This was not just a political miscalculation. It was a death sentence for the kingdom. That very day, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel declared their secession. The nation split in two. The schism that had been brewing for decades beneath the surface erupted in a single day because of one phrase from one young king. The temple remained in Jerusalem, in the smaller of the two states that emerged from the split. It stood for almost 400 more years, but the unified kingdom, for which it was built as a symbol, disappeared that day forever. And here, ask yourself, what exactly destroyed this story? Not enemies, not money, not time. It was destroyed by a single decision made by a young man who did not listen to those who knew how the world worked. Rehoboam listened only to his peers, those who had grown up in the palace and had never carried a stone into the mountain's darkness. And they were the ones who gave him the answer that destroyed everything. But this story has another, much heavier layer. The temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem after a siege, plundered it, and burned it to the ground. The gold, all 3,400 tons, whatever remained after centuries of wars and expenses, was carried away. The sacred objects were taken as spoils of war. The Ark of the Covenant vanished. No one knows where. To this day, not a single credible archaeological find provides an answer. The most protected object in the history of ancient Israel, that very point between the cherubim, the place one entered with a rope tied to one's leg, it disappeared 3,000 years ago, and it has never been found. Only the stone remains, the foundation. The very rock on which the Holy of Holies stood still exists. Today, the dome of the rock, a Muslim shrine, stands over it. It is a place so contested and so charged that it remains one of the primary points of geopolitical tension on the planet. 3,000 years have passed, and this stone still turns people into enemies. And here is the final, haunting question. 790,000 square meters of gold inside. Silence on the construction site. A rope on the high priest's leg. A cloud that filled the building on its dedication day. Forced labor as the foundation of sanctity. The schism of a kingdom as a consequence of building a symbol of unity. And the disappearance of the most important object, without a trace, without explanation, without a discovery. This is not a story about a temple. It is a story of how greatness and tragedy are forged from the same material. How, at the foundation of every symbol of peace, can lie someone's uncompensated labor. How a single person's decision, made in 3 minutes, can destroy what took decades to build. And how a place that was meant to be a meeting point between heaven and earth became a point around which people kill each other to this very day. You thought this was a story from 3,000 years ago. It's not. It's a story that has never ended. It continues right now, in the news, in conflicts, in bloodshed. Its center is simply that stone beneath the golden dome, the one you've seen in photographs 1,000 times, and perhaps never considered what lies beneath it. Now you know. Leave a comment. Did you think the story of Solomon's temple was about religion? Or did you already know it was about power, money, and the price of greatness?